Everybody was expecting the Fed to lower down the rates because the economy was slowing down and chances of a recession was rising. So the natural thing would be to lower down interest rates in order to prevent the economy from falling into a recession. However, the Federal Reserve decided to keep the rates unchanged and freeze them. If you paid attention, he hinted at the fact that there is a possibility that the rates will be frozen for the entire 2025. And there is also a chance that they might even increase the rates. What exactly has happened that forced the Fed to change their perspective and now reconsider all the decisions that they have been taking over the last year or so? Because the trajectory for 2025 was to lower the rates up to 3%. And anything that the Fed does has a direct impact, not just on the entire economy, but on the entire global economy. But most importantly, for people like me and you, for investors who are investing in the stock market, lowering down interest rates would actually lead some stocks to rise and others to fall, and vice versa. So it's very important for us to understand what exactly is happening with the Fed. Now, to understand Fed's logic, we have to understand what is the motivation of the Fed, why the Fed does what they do. So the Federal Reserve has two main goals. Number one is full employment, and number two is stable prices. Now, if we take a look at the employment in the United States, they've done a pretty good job because unemployment in the US is around 4.1%. That is not bad. There was a spike back in 2020. However, it got down. Now it has been around 4% for the past year or two, which is great. So that's not something that the Fed is worried. In fact, the GDP, according to the Fed, has grown by over 2% last year. So that is another great sign. The second goal that the Fed has is to make sure that inflation isn't out of control. And that's where the real problem rises, because inflation has been a problem since 2022, where it rose to around 8 to 9%. They did a good job to bring it down to around 3%, but ever since they couldn't hit the goal of achieving 2%. Just look at the data. They brought it down to around 4 to 3%. Just when we thought that we are on a way to lower down inflation to 2%, it actually rises back to around 3%. And that sends a signal to the Federal Reserve that maybe it's too early to lower down the rates. Now, if you go and take a look at the specific numbers, you see the exact same thing. December 2024, it's 2.9%, November 2.7%, October 2.6%, and September 2.4%. What do you see here? You see a clear increase in inflation rate over the last 5 to 6 months. That is why the Fed is reluctant. Now, another thing you have to understand about the Fed is Fed takes CPI as one of the main measures in order to measure inflation. CPI is Consumer Price Index, which is not literally reliable. Now, if you watched my previous videos, you know that you can't rely on those numbers. And that is why you see house prices rise by 10-20% or energy prices rise by 15 to 30%, but they do not reflect on CPI report. They do not reflect on inflation numbers. Why? Because inflation numbers are accurately designed in such a way where they undermine and underestimate the inflation reports. Now, that is a completely different topic that I talked about in previous videos, but that's something that the Fed wants to prevent. Because the first thing that happens when we have inflation is asset prices rise. And because most of the assets within the society is concentrated in the hands of a few people, or not just a few people, but a small group of people, so the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And that's why if you want to get out of this rat race and you want to benefit every time there is inflation, you have to make sure that your money is wisely invested in the right assets that grow together with inflation. Otherwise, you will be like the vast majority of people who suffer from inflation. By the way, if you need help with that, make sure to check the first link in the description. The second problem the Fed has is unpredictability of Trump. You see, Fed's action have a direct influence over the market. Whatever the Fed is going to do, the next moment it's going to impact everything. And that's why for the Fed to take action, they need to have a clear data to back up their claim, to back up whatever decision they take. But when we have a person such as Trump, who is the president of the United States, and he's making all of these claims, they are letting the Fed to be in the dark, and the Fed doesn't know what's going to happen. Literally, this is what the Fed said. This is what the chairman of the Fed said, Jay Powell, that we don't know what is going to happen to tariffs. We don't know what is going to happen to fiscal policy. We don't know what's going to happen to immigration and a long list of other issues. Let me give you an example how that contradicts with the Fed's goal. Imagine that Trump wants to change the fiscal policy, which is actually lowering down taxation and increasing government spending, for example. If the government overspends, that's going to stimulate the spending throughout the entire economy and will lead inflation to rise. That's a great thing for President Trump since he is the president, but that's a bad thing and goes against the goal of the Fed, which is stabilizing prices. And if your goal is to make sure inflation doesn't get out of hand and fiscal policy is driving the economy and driving spending within the economy, you want to increase the interest rates in order to balance that. Let's take another example to understand that. Trump has been talking about tariffs all of this time, but the Fed doesn't know what kind of tariffs Trump is going to impose, how high these tariffs are going to be, how long they will keep the tariffs, on which countries is going to impose all of these tariffs, which is not letting the Fed to actually take a proper informed decision. A tariff is a tax on foreign goods and services. So if Trump is going to impose a 50% tariff on everything that is brought out from China, what do you think businesses are going to do? They will take that tax and they will pass it down to their clients and customers. And you are the person at the end of the day who will pay for that, which means that an increase in tariffs are going to lead to rises in prices. And how is that going to impact Fed's goals? The Fed wants to lower down inflation, but tariffs are going to increase inflation, which is why Fed cannot take appropriate measures right now since they don't know what kind of tariffs President Trump is going to impose. Take another example, immigration. Trump said multiple times that he wants to fix immigration in the US. So if you stop the inflow of immigrants to the US, number one, and secondly, you get rid of all the undocumented immigrants within the United States, what is going to happen to the economy where there is a huge shortage of labor already? Businesses will have to pay more in order to attract talent. Businesses will have to pay more in order to attract labor, and they will take that increase in paying more their employees and they will pass it down to their clients, which means that it will reflect on the prices, increasing inflation. And the job of the Fed is to lower down inflation. And that is why the Fed doesn't know what Trump is going to do. And even if they know what Trump is going to do, they don't know to what extent that will impact the economy, which is leaving them in the dark and does not allow them to take appropriate measures. You see, Trump and the Fed have the exact same goals, which is growing up the economy and lowering down prices. But Trump wants to do it in his own way. But that's not the way that the Fed actually sees it. For example, Trump wants to bring down prices by lowering down oil prices because everything depends on the prices of oil. Everything is shipped from one place to another. If you lower down oil prices, you will lower down the prices of everything. And his strategy is to force everybody to oversupply the market with as much oil as possible in order for oil prices to come down as much as possible. That sounds like a reasonably great plan. However, how do you implement such a plan? You have to go to the major exporters of oil, such as OPEC countries, talking about Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, and a long list of other countries. And you have to tell them to lower down oil prices by overproducing. Now, take Saudi Arabia, whose budget comes mainly from selling oil and gas to the world. Probably 80% of their budget. So if oil prices go down, the budget of that country is going to go down. Is that something that Saudi Arabia wants? Is that something that every other oil exporter wants? Well, obviously not. Even if you take US companies who are selling oil and gas, they don't want that because lowering down oil prices will make them make less money. And that's not something in the favor of that business. It's not something in the interest of the investors of those oil companies. So the Fed doesn't know to what extent Trump can actually achieve something like that. Trump wants to grow the economy, which is the most natural thing to want to as a president of the United States. And he wants to do that by lowering down taxes. If you lower down taxes, it is going to stimulate demand within the economy. It can lead to a huge rise in prices. To what extent those prices are going to rise, we don't know for a fact, and the Fed doesn't know as well. And because the Fed doesn't know, they cannot take any appropriate measures right now. So what is going to happen right now? The Fed is most likely simply going to wait until Trump takes his actions, and then they will watch how those actions are going to influence the economy, how those actions are going to influence the market, and then at the end of that, they will take appropriate measures. It is going to be a nightmare for the Fed for the next 4 years because they will have to deal that for the next 4 years. But on the other side, what the Fed can possibly do? They have to work with the President of the United States. They literally have no other options. So they might actually lower the rates, but not in the next 5 to 6 months, but rather they will wait long enough until they are confident in their decisions. But I am not really sure how that is going to work because Trump made it clear that he's going to force the Fed to lower down the rates. You're a professional investor, you know that whether the Fed is going to increase the rates or lower down the rates, you know in which assets to invest in order to keep making money and keep your money growing. And that's one of the best things to be as an investor because you know that whether the market is going to crash or the market is going to grow, you know how to make money regardless of the state of the market. And that's why the wealth or the gap between the rich and the poor keeps growing, especially when there is a crisis, especially when there is a market crash. Anyways, thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.